Welcome to the creepy chef's kitchen, where fear is always on the menu. Tonight's special, stories seasoned with scares and garnished with goosebumps. Smash subscribe and ring that bell. It's your ticket to our midnight buffet of horror. Now, let's dig in. The nightmares are served.
In 2002, I lived on a mountain in southern New Hampshire for a few years now. The mountain used to be mined for iron ore, so there are places at the top where the radio tower is located that has tunnels in the land that if you fall in, no one would find you. We had a small house that was located in a clearing where there were woods all around us and a dirt road that just barely allowed two cars to pass each other. In the summertime, we would wake up to see spotlights shining from above and shutting off, followed by the sounds of helicopters. We knew they were looking for pot growers. I had never come across these growers, but being on the state line between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, it would not surprise me. A few years of seeing these spotlights and hearing the helicopter, it became nothing new until one night. Our windows were open, so the evening breeze would flow through the house and you could hear the comforting sounds of crickets. I woke up because there was a bright spotlight over our house. Again, I thought. I tried to go back to sleep, but for some reason, I had a strange feeling. The crickets were no longer chirping. I decided to get up and check our two boys in the nursery and headed to the bathroom. After seeing they were sound asleep, I started to close their door when another bright spotlight lit up our dark home. It was then I noticed I did not hear the helicopters. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears. The light went out and I shrugged. I headed to the bathroom. I never turned on the lights when I went to the bathroom or moved around the house at night. Even though it was very dark and there were no street lights, I found that I knew our home well and could see pretty good at night. I went to the bathroom, and again, the bathroom lit up with a spotlight over the house. Finished up and decided I would head out to the back deck and see if I could tell what was going on. But as I started to unlock the door, I had a strange feeling. Like this was not a good idea. I could not figure out why, but I did as my gut told me to. I walked back to our bedroom and the light seemed to dim. I remember thinking that I had never seen the spotlights dimming before, nor had I seen the spotlights staying over our house for so long. I paused at the bedroom door listening. I decided to wake my husband. I walked in and I saw a tall figure standing by my bed. I am 5'6" and my husband is 6'2". He usually slept in the nude, so when I saw a tall figure next to my bed, I thought he had gotten up and realized I was not there and was checking on me. I walked by the figure and I even put my hand on his chest. I said, I was sorry, I was in the bathroom. The dim light went out and the figure headed out the bedroom door. I suddenly heard my husband snoring. It startled me. Who was standing by my side of the bed? I do not know why I never woke my husband up, but I sprinted out the bedroom door and immediately headed to the boys' room in a panic. I opened the door and flicked on a small light that gave just enough shine to not wake them, but I could see in the room. They are both in bed. I closed the windows and the door went to the kitchen for a knife. Someone is in my house. I started flicking on the lights and checked every room, all clear. I checked the attic and the basement, all clear. I checked to make sure all the doors were locked, all locked. What? My husband awoke and came out rubbing his eyes. He asked what I was doing. I just said someone is in the house. Before he could react, the spotlight came back on and shut off again. Now that my husband was up, I ran to the sliders to go out to the deck, and when I went out, the spotlight went off. My husband joined me and we watched something in the sky that did not make any noise, hovering slowly over the trees, shining the spotlight, then shutting it off, moving a little ways, on, off, over and over until we could no longer see the light. I still have no idea what that was, nor who I saw standing next to my bed. My husband took his gun out and did a thorough check of our house. No one was there. First off, a little backstory on my dad. The man has so much character and color to him. Though he is mostly a chilled-out grandpa at this point, whose biggest offenses are the likes of placing a box of dead kittens in the topic hat when the family plays charades at the Christmas Eve get-together. When I was a kid, he was a crazy person. He was an amazing father, honest to a fault, and had character made of stone. He apologized when he felt he was wrong, and he would sit and cry with you when things were eating away at your self-esteem. However, as much as I owe him my morality and compassion towards others, I also owe him my extremely demented and nothing is sacred sense of humor. The man got more joy from life in tormenting his children than anything else. We lived on my grandmother's farm in rural Tennessee, and when the power would go out, which happened a lot in our area, he would dare me to run to the mailbox and then lock me outside at 10 o'clock at night when I'm about 10 years old. And he would laugh so hard I could hear him over my screams while I banged on the door from the outside, pleading to be let back in. He was the type of dad to wake you up in the morning by revving a chainsaw, change the clocks in the house to make you get ready for school at 2 a.m., and stand on the front porch in his tighty-whities while you were getting on the bus in the morning and yell, "I love you, I'm gonna miss you so bad," in a voice that could only imply that he was suffering from severe brain damage. In other words, he was always looking for a way to scare you, embarrass you, or just make you have such a crazy, unexpected experience that you would be guaranteed to remember him forever. And it worked. I love that man. Now, that was needed for context, and this story takes place in my second to last year on my grandmother's farm. I was 17 and had been working a job in my small town, stocking beer coolers and mopping floors at the local gas station. I was driving home from work in my little truck at about 10 p.m., and as I pulled into the driveway, my headlights shone up the hill to my grandmother's house and panned down the hill to the edge of our single-wide mobile home. I stopped immediately. All four tires in the driveway pointing straight to end of that straight stretch of gravel, I could see my dad. His old flatbed truck and my stepmother's minivan were parked pointing to the left at the base of our trailer. He was standing behind them with his back to my headlights. Our chocolate lab, Cassie, sat at his feet, staring intently at him, paying no attention to the vehicle entering her territory, which was highly unlike her. I only stopped because it was so late and so unusual for my dad to be outside at this time. It was in the middle of the week. He was usually passed out in his recliner, wearing nothing but his underwear, with the History Channel quietly rambling on about the Civil War by this time. I slowly proceeded down the drive. Our driveway was about half a football field in length, and as I drove slowly toward the bottom of the drive, my dad began to walk, still with his back turned to me, and stepped behind the vehicles, the height of my stepmom's van fully concealing him. It took another 15 seconds from that point for me to reach the end of the drive, and I pulled my truck in on the side of his flatbed, leaving me closest to the road. I grabbed my big gulp and got out of the truck. "Dad?" No response. "Dad?" Still nothing. Immediately, I got a bit creeped out, but then thought to myself nearly as quick, this dude is trying to scare me again. He must think I didn't see him. I got down on my knee and peered under the vehicles. His left boot. Unmistakable. Cassie's back legs and butt right beside him, tail tucked between her legs. I hollered out, "You're doing a crappy job of hiding, Dad. I can see your boot sticking out from behind the tire on the van." I watched as his left boot slowly slid to the right until it was concealed behind the tire with the other. Still no response. I called for the dog. "Cassie!" She turned and literally scurried beneath the vehicles to get to me, as if she was under heavy gunfire. She was whimpering when she got to me and acting very strange, as if she was terrified. She was acting how I would imagine a dog would act if they were constantly beat on, and I had never seen her behave that way before. When she got to me and I placed my hand on her, you could almost hear her breathe a sigh of relief. She was sticking to my legs like glue, and as I was still down on one knee and a bit off balance, she nearly knocked me over. I pet on her for a moment and tried to comfort her, but she seemed like she was afraid of something. With her tail still tucked between her legs, she pushed herself in between my legs as I stood up. It was after seeing how timid and odd Cassie was acting that I decided that I may be misreading the situation and I might need to get into the house. My dad was surely a prankster, but when he was caught, he was caught. He never drug things out once we caught on. He would come out and say something like, "I guess you kids ain't as gullible as you used to be. I'm gonna have to start stepping it up a notch." Dad didn't drink much and never got drunk really, but I couldn't think of what the root of this odd behavior could possibly be, and it really started to weird me out. I made one last attempt at communication. "Dad, I know you're there. I saw you when I pulled in the driveway. The jig is up. What are you doing out here?" No response. I started around the front of my truck to round the vehicles and walk over to him. Cassie began to panic and whimper loudly, still glued to the inside of my ankles, crouched to the gravel with her head darting back and forth wildly. I stopped in front of my truck. I stand there for another moment in silence, waiting for something, but not sure what, and then announce, "Welp, I'm heading in. See you in a bit, weirdo." I turn to walk to the front porch, unconsciously building speed as I hit the first step. Cassie drops back and doesn't follow me onto the porch, but seems to sort of stand guard at the foot of the steps. Keys in hand, I'm already searching for the deadbolt key. Panic is building in my chest, but I'm not sure why. I hurriedly unlock the door and jump into the house, swing around and slam the door behind me, locking the deadbolt all in one fluid motion. From behind me, I hear a voice yell, "What the hell?" I spin around. My big gulp drops to the floor and explodes across the living room floor. There sits my dad in his underwear, sitting up from a deep sleep in his recliner. I begin to hyperventilate and yell through gasps of air that there's a man in the driveway hiding behind the van. "I thought he was you. I was talking to him. Dad!" I nearly collapsed into the floor. Within 15 seconds, my dad is running out the back door of the house with a spotlight and a handgun, still wearing nothing but his underwear. He was outside for what felt like forever. When he came in, he was pale as a sheet. He said someone was definitely out there, but he couldn't see them. He could hear them running, but when he pointed the spotlight in the direction of the footsteps, there was no one there. Crazy thing is, our trailer sat at the front of a 150-acre cornfield, and it was off-season, so everything was tilled down to the dirt. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. It was a terrifying experience, and I know it's one that seems easy to explain. My brain really wants to tell me that I had just foiled a car thief or something, or maybe even stopped a possible home invasion. The thing is, though, my dad has an unmistakable posture and an even more unmistakable walk. I know those were his boots I saw under the van. I also know that if he had somehow set all this up, I would have heard about it for years, because it would have been one of his favorite stories to tell, how he scared me so bad when I was 17, and how funny it would have been. And he does tell people about this from time to time, but he always ends with the same detail, that it wasn't until he was outside running around in his underwear with a handgun that I realized that Cassie had been sleeping in the floor next to his recliner when I ran in the door. This is a real-life, 100% story that happened to me. In 2003, I had met a guy that said he would take me on adventures and make my life exciting. Little did I know that the safe world I'd grown up with was about to get shattered. I lived in a small town and had never really traveled outside of my state, never experienced life in a way that others would. We were kind of sheltered from the big crime and other things that have been happening over the countryside. So my now ex decided to take me on a journey of being an over-the-road truck driver. In a lot of cases, this was a great experience there, where a lot of fun times, and I got to see most of the US. But trucking life is hard, and being on the road 24/7 isn't easy. Being cooped up in a small truck with someone for that long will cause anyone to become mad. Life on the road is much different now than it was when I was trucking. People now have advancement in technology and the ability to binge watch your favorite YouTube channel, surf the web, or play games on your phone to keep yourself occupied. The only forms of entertainment we had was either watching one of the dozen or so DVDs, reading yet another book, or talking on the radio. We often opted for talking on the radio, and this became our version of social media. Long before Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter were even a thought. Just like we do now, we create a different identity or persona to hide behind while interacting with people who are basically strangers. And trust me, truckers can be creepy AF, and keeping a bit of anonymity the only way to stay safe on the road. When you're a trucker, you acquire a CB handle. My ex's was Ninja Dwarf, changed for his safety, and me, since I was a baby, Barley 20-0, and I'm from the Alaska, so mine ended up being Northern Exposure, again changed for safety reasons. During the time on the road, you meet a lot of crazy people and you see a ton of crazy shit. And I do mean a ton of crazy shit. People often hear about stories of things that happen on the road. Most of them are more gross than scary. Like drivers getting a little too friendly with their cabin buddy, whether it be a dog, cat, or even goat. But this time was one of the most terrifying experiences I had in my life. And when it comes to strange and unusual events, my life is full of them. Have you ever gotten the heebie-jeebies from someone's voice? Like flat out scared to talk to someone, a voice that makes you think that the person on the other line is not all there? That was this guy. Something about him just made my skin crawl, and I had only ever heard his voice through the crackle of the CB radio. The CB started to crackle, and we heard the distant call. You could barely hear a voice through the static, but eventually he got close enough we could hear him clearly. He must have been 50 miles or so behind us because it was still faint, but our CB radio was peaked and tweaked and could really reach out and touch someone, so we could just hear him through the chatter of the CB. And then I heard it, that voice. It's hard to explain, but the best way I could now describe it would be like how Heath Ledger talks as Joker in the Batman movie. There was something just off about it, and it gave me the chills. He simply said, "Hey there, Purple Pete, the color of our truck. Where you headed?" My ex hollered back, "We were heading to Arkansas." The driver said he was going the same way and asked if he could tag along with us and introduced himself as Maniac. We would run from one coast to the other and back again. The guy always seemed to be running the same route as us, but we had never physically seen his truck. He described it as a 378 long-nosed Peterbilt that was black and had a brow and cattle guard. According to him, he ran dry box from California to Florida, which explained why he always seemed to be either coming or going on the I-10. One week, when we were running from Florida back to LA, we caught up to him on his back trip from Redmond, Washington to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He told us he would meet up with us in Nevada when we did our trip back, because by that time, we would have run out of hours and needed to take a rest. We said sure, even though I totally didn't want to meet this guy. My ex had become friends with him, so we gave him an ETA on when we would be back in the area and what truck stop we would be at, and told him we would meet up for a meal with him. This was really before the idea of having a cell phone for anything other than emergencies, so it wasn't like we could just call him when we were going to be in the area. He agreed, and we parted ways. My ex continued talking to him until the radios would no longer reach. We had finished our load and were heading back to Las Vegas to the truck stop we agreed on and waited. Las Vegas is a shady place for truckers in general. Lots of crime, lots of bad stuff happens, so we waited in the truck. Finally, we got bored and ventured into the truck stop for a bit. We waited and eventually killed enough time where we could take another load, so we headed out, never actually meeting up with him in Nevada. But a few months later, we ran into him in Oklahoma. We had heard some chatter on the radio about these lot lizards, truck stop hookers, getting brutally murdered at truck stops in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. But we chalked it up to drama on the radio. After all, we had quite literally nothing better to do than to make up truck driver stories. We had kept hearing about it and even brought it up to Maniac, and he just laughed and said it must be one real sick fuck doing it. It must just be a story, because if it was true, they would have caught him already. I bet he has even left fingerprints or semen at the crime scene. With as bloody and messy as it was, I bet he wants to get caught. Seemed like a weird thing to say, but he was a very weird guy, so that was totally in character for him. Maniac went his way, and we went ours. And after a while, I forgot about the weird comment. Fast forward to a few weeks later, we were in Mississippi, and we hear a familiar voice on the radio. It was Maniac. We had taken a long weekend because it was Labor Day, and most companies were okay with drivers taking an extra day off. Our plan was to make it to this lake out in the middle of nowhere. We were going to drop our trailer and head out bobtail. So we chatted, and he said he was heading to Tennessee and that he would be heading out the next morning. And so, cutting our much-needed break short and bypassing the weekend at the lake, my ex decided to run with him so that there was someone to talk to. We had gotten into an argument earlier, and I wasn't talking to him, and he absolutely hated the silent treatment. Our load was to deliver in North Carolina in a few days, so being a few hours ahead of the deadline just meant we would be at the top of the line to pick our load back. Win-win. We left that morning and headed out. The guys decided we would stop in Tennessee and finally, after about 6 months of chatting, meet each other. We weren't afraid to meet up with him, but I was still very on edge. Now I was no slouch. I grew up with 15 boys in the house and was a known fighter. My ex was a bigger dude, standing 6'3" and about 280 pounds, so in theory we could take him if need be. The only way he could get the best of us was if he had a weapon, which back then was highly illegal to have in the trucks, and if you were caught by DOT, it was jail time, no questions asked. With our company, we had very specific fuel stations we could use to top off. Maniac was an owner-operator, so he could go anywhere. Maniac said he'd already stopped to get fuel and took a shower, but he would drop his trailer and meet us at a Flying J petrol station that was down the road from where he was, which I believe was a Love's fuel station. So we get ready to fuel up, we showered and got a booth at the restaurant. We waited about 45 minutes before ordering food. And waited and waited. No one ever showed up and there was no way to contact him. My ex was not a patient man, so we ate and then headed back to our truck. I remember it being dark and humid. It was probably 10 p.m. or so. There wasn't much for noise in this truck stop, which was unnerving. A quiet truck stop is a creepy truck stop. We walked across the fuel island to be greeted to a shit ton of flashing lights. It's not uncommon for either lizards to get busted or drivers to get involved in shit they are not supposed to, so we didn't think much of it. Cops in a truck stop go hand in hand, but this was more than just your typical truck stop shenanigans. We passed 12 trucks or so. This was one of the bigger Flying J's, so it could probably fit about 80 truck and trailers if you went all the way back to the dirt. And then you could Tetris a dozen or so trucks in the dirt lot, which happened to be where our truck was. Now, I'm a curvy girl, not fat, but I don't look like I belong in a truck stop. I was used to drivers looking at me all creepy like. I always got taunted and harassed for being a lot lizard, even though I was a driver. In fact, there are some truck stops that are not safe to walk in alone. I was walking with my ex and we weren't holding hands or anything, but it was obvious I was with him. We walked down the row and saw a bobtail truck parked in a full parking spot. I thought it was weird he was in a truck space with no trailer. Typically, bobtail trucks will park at the end of a run and leave the big spaces for trucks with trailers because that was, again, another unspoken truck driver rule. We moved by the bobtail truck. It was dark truck, maybe a dark black or blue, with a cattle guard and a brow. I don't remember seeing what type of truck it was, just that it was kind of menacing in the dark. Old school trucker code was, if you were looking for company, the driver would park and leave his reading red light on to tell lot lizards that the driver was looking for entertainment. The guy was sitting in the passenger seat. He had the red reading light on so I could see his face. It was a little distorted, but he gave me the creepiest smile and then quickly shut his blinds. We were about 6 trucks down from the bobtail. I could see his truck from ours. I remember looking back and seeing the red light sill illuminating the porthole window in the passenger door, and a small slit down the curtain showed a dark spot. He was still watching us. Even with as warm as it was, chills shot up my spine, and I got a very uneasy feeling. My gut wrenched with a sudden feeling of dread. We finally got back to the truck and turned on the CB for our night entertainment and to see if we could radio Maniac to see what the deal was. The chatter was about all the cops and the ambulance fire truck and DOT, All the commotion was basically across from us, but 2 rows up. People were saying there was a dead lot lizard and that it was bad, like gnarly. One driver started trying to explain it, but he was then told that he had to keep his mouth shut by a police officer. Being the nosy people we are, my ex and I jump out of the truck to go investigate. We dodged in and out of the trucks and managed to wiggle our way up to the scene. You know when you hear the phrase, "Some things cannot be unseen." This was one of them. The lady, what was left of her, had been tied to the trailer and the truck. Then someone pulled the kingpin, that piece that locks the two together, and let down the landing gear. The driver, who was now sitting in the back of a police car, cuffed. His head hung limp with his forehead on the back of the seat. He was crying big, heavy sobs, and there was vomit on his shirt. We could hear them through the closed door, wailing that he had nothing to do it and praying to God to be forgiven for what he had done. That poor driver had obviously not done his safety check before he left and just decided to pull out of his space, while she was attached. Without getting too graphic, I can tell you that a normal human body should never look like that. And it was like something you would probably see in the Saw movies. I remember stumbling back and bumping into another driver. He just looked at me, pale, and looked as if he was going to get sick. I don't do well with that body function, so I moved quickly away from him and started making my way back to the truck. I was almost running back. I didn't care that I should have waited for my ex, because he had the keys. I made it to the truck and tugged on the door, but it wouldn't open. So I ran to the truck stop full speed. I was going to get sick, and I would rather not have people see me. I passed the spot where the bobtail truck was parked, and it was gone. My ex made it into the truck stop looking for me, and he said he would walk me back to the truck so I could get some sleep. Yeah, right? Like I could sleep after seeing that. He turned on the radio and began to talk to the other drivers. No one had seen anything. There hadn't even been much lizard traffic. The police had been working overtime cleaning up the truck stops after they had caught wind of the first few murders. I sat in the bunk and just kind of stared out of the windshield at the flashing lights. There was a tap on the door. A police officer said he was getting statements from everyone in the truck stop, giving us the rundown about safety in numbers and to not go anywhere alone. I wasn't planning on leaving the truck. I told him about the creepy guy that smiled at me in the bobtail truck and the description of the truck. The officer didn't see the point of me telling him about a creepy guy, but he took down the information anyway. I don't think I slept for days after that. I just kept seeing that image. Flashes kept going through my head. The vivid image of her face, she had a red rag in her mouth and the 100 miles per hour tape around her wrists, tying her to the headache rack. She had obviously struggled because there were bruises formed on her stomach and her face, mascara was running down her cheeks, and the smell like rotted meat and blood. Makes my stomach queasy just thinking about it. It didn't seem to faze my ex. He went on like it wasn't anything big or special. After a few weeks, I finally managed to get the image out of my head, or I had finally convinced myself that it wasn't real and it was just a scene from a horror movie. Either way, I was glad for the time being having it out of my head. Fast forward, and it was February, about 3 months after that incident, and we were heading to New Orleans. I was super excited to see the area and hopefully get in to see the Mardi Gras. I wanted to visit the cemeteries to see the mausoleums and go into the voodoo shops and such. We had a few extra hours to spend there, so I was happy when my ex said we could go wandering around. We parked at this little truck stop. It was one that didn't show up on the big Rand McNally maps. We were told about it by another driver. It really wasn't more than a hole-in-the-wall mom and pop shop with a small dirt lot and a flickering light pole on one end, but it was within walking distance into the French Quarter, which was where I wanted to go. Hey there, Purple Pete. What brings you out this way? The voice on the CB was loud, so he was really, really close. There was only 2 other trucks in the lot. An old Freightliner hauling a Swift trailer and a dark green Kenworth that had a cattle car on the back hauling cows. My ex was still a bit miffed about being stood up months ago. He could really hold a grudge when he wanted. Maniac, hey man, where the hell have you been? Why did you stand us up there, good buddy? My ex radioed back. "Oh man, you know how it is? Cops make me a bit uneasy and I'd rather not get fucking caught," he said with a chuckle. "Caught? What do you mean caught?" My ex questioned. "Don't worry about it. You just keep an eye on your girl. I'd really hate for something bad happen to her. Like all of those other girls," he trailed off. We watched the CB key up again, burying the needle on the radio. The signal high, it had to be in the same truck stop to ping so high. He was keyed up, but just kind of breathing in the mic. "You know, with all the bad things I have been doing in the truck stops, I like to play with the lizards before I torture them and destroy them. Those nasty lizards. They shouldn't be defiling themselves with the drugs and stuff like they do." It sounded like he was talking through gritted teeth. His voice was even louder this time. We could hear the rumble of a truck heading down the one-way street that ended in the truck stop. "Only God and the devil himself can judge me for my sins. I will continue to rid this world of the diseased ones that plague humanity." We looked at each other. This was the only time I had ever seen anything like fear in my ex's eyes. Tears began to well up, and for the first time I was scared, like truly scared. A dust cloud came rolling up into the truck stop, and this dark black menacing Peterbilt with a cattle guard and brow came rolling by slowly. The driver keyed up just as he went past the nose of our truck. It was that same creepy guy from the truck stop months ago. He smiled that disgusting smile at us as he put the mic to his lips. "Be safe out there, Ninja Dwarf and Northern Exposure." His CB handle was pinstriped on his driver door. It said Maniac in bright red letters. In April of 2004, we headed back to Alaska because my ex's father had a massive heart attack. We stayed there for a while before heading back on the road. As far as I know, there were 7 total murders. There could have been more. Who knows how long he had actually been ridding the world of its sins. I don't know if the guy was ever caught. I can tell you one thing, though. The second time around, I wasn't making friends with anyone on the road, and I always kept a 6-inch blade on me at all times, just in case I ever ran into Maniac. At the time of the sleepover, it was me and my best friend, both age 7 or 8. We are both now 16 and 17 and haven't talked about the incident since. We lived in Florida, about 15 minutes away from Tampa. It was one of our many sleepovers we had, and it was no different from others. We played with Barbies, watched movies, read books until we couldn't take it anymore, and went to bed around 9 or 10. I turned off the lights and climbed up to my top bunk where both me and my friend were going to sleep. As I laid down, something immediately didn't feel right. The house I lived in was relatively old, and our landlord sucked and never came to fix anything, let alone did he only care when our rent was due. Before getting in bed, I flipped on my fan and had my mom turn the AC down. But as I got in bed, my fan was turned off, so was the AC. But I thought the power went out and didn't think much of it. About 20 minutes go by and I can't sleep, and I feel like I'm dying of heat stroke. I'm not sure if my friend is awake, so I say her name quietly. She responds immediately, saying, "I can't sleep, but it's not because it's hot." I look over and can barely see her but her silhouette. I look up at the ceiling and sigh and say, "What is it then?" She responds saying, "It's the man in the corner." When I say I got chills, I got chills. I look over at her slowly and then turn my head to look at the corner. I thought she was lying because I didn't see anything. I let out a breath of air I didn't know I was holding in. I go to adjust my blanket, and that's when I see him. A man, dark and tall, seeming to stare at both of us. I immediately grip my friend's hand and close my eyes hard. "We have to get my mom," I whispered, and I felt my friend nod. But we both laid there, unable to move. All of a sudden, I feel the movement of someone climbing up the ladder and crawling slowly. The blankets moved with the movement, and I slowly opened my eyes to watch the man slowly starting to crawl towards us. I was gasping for air and looked over to see my friend watching too, paralyzed from moving. I look back at the man and can only see his outline, no features. I hold my friend's hand tight and say, "Scream when I tap your finger." I barely got out in a whisper. She slowly nodded, and as I watched the man slowly reach for my face, I tapped her hand and we both screamed bloody murder. My mom came running in, no later than 20 seconds, and turned on the light, and both me and my friend were holding each other crying. There was no trace of the man, and my mom checked all doors, saying they were locked and weren't even touched. We both slept on the couch that night, watching Barbie movies and holding each other tightly. To this day, I don't know what it was or who it was, but I will always remember the eerie feeling of death being close to my face. Hi all, this happened to me about 11 years ago when walking home from a friend's house at night. I'll just get straight into it. I used to live in a rural part of the UK and have lived in rural areas most of my life, so I was used to long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never bothered me too much. I'd get creeped out occasionally, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I ever had. There was this one friend who used to live roughly 3 miles away from my house. He had cool parents, and my other friends and I would often go over his house and play video games and hang out. Occasionally, this meant walking home at night if I stayed late. There were 2 ways back from his house: the roadway, which was about 5 miles long and took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were very quiet and eerie sometimes, but they were lit by street lamps, so it never bothered me walking this way. The other way was a shortcut through some woods, which took off about 2 miles, and the wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored the wooded shortcut and have probably walked it over 100 times. The woods were dark, however, combined with the lack of ambient light due to living in a rural area, and you had absolute abyssal darkness. Luckily, most of the time I had my phone light to walk with, but sometimes my phone would die or the battery would be so low the flash wouldn't work and I'd have to use my screen light. As you've probably guessed by now, this was one of those occasions. I remember my friends and I had just finished watching a film. It was nearing 10 p.m., so we all left my friend's house and headed our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly which way I should go and decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed into the woods. The streetlights dimmed as I entered the fields before the woods. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was really low, only enough power left for a couple of minutes of flash, and then I'd have to use my screen for light. That wouldn't last the whole way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the flash and followed the well-trodden path into the dark. To my dismay, my light died within seconds of entering, and I flipped my phone over to try and shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for all of the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. Funky tree stump, check. Half-fallen fir tree, check. Enormous puddle I had to jump over, check. All was going well. I was halfway through the woods when my phone completely died. I remember the moment it happened, I was engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've experienced this level of darkness before, but it was so dark I couldn't even see the outline of my hand centimeters in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed considerably, and I started holding my hand out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued walking for another minute or so until all of a sudden a pungent smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. I glanced around but couldn't see anything. Then I heard it, a cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods in the dark? Are they following me? Am I lost? I quickened my pace again, throwing a little caution to the wind. I carried on walking and tripped slightly on a branch. As I regained my balance, I heard another sound. Branches breaking underfoot, what sounded like right behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps that grew louder and louder. I started sprinting. I felt the well-trodden path turn to brush. I felt branches, logs, and plants hitting my legs. It wasn't long before I fell. Hard. I was lying on the floor, holding my knee. I could still hear branches snapping around me and a voice muttering something. I didn't dare move. Then all of a sudden, they turned on a torch. I couldn't see anything except for the beam of light, which seemed to be eaten quickly by the darkness of the forest. I lay motionless on the ground as the beam swept through the trees. I could still hear the person mumbling, a deep growl. The crunching of footfalls grew and grew. They were only several feet from me by this point. I couldn't breathe. The light went out, the snapping of branches grew, and then nothing. Quiet. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything. Then I could hear wheezing. Right. Above. Me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me and I wouldn't know. This carried on for about 5 minutes until the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs started up again and got fainter and fainter as they moved away from me. I remained lying down for another 5 or 10 minutes, contemplating my escape. Like an idiot, I'd run off the path and wasn't sure which way was back to it or was home. I didn't really care, I thought. I was going to walk in one direction until I left the woods and get home from there. I knew as soon as I started moving again, if the person was still in the woods, they would hear me. Should I run or try and sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings, picked a direction and started walking. I wasn't perfectly quiet, but quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in the distance, and every time I froze. I'd hold my breath until I was happy no one was there and then start walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity until eventually I found the path. I screamed for joy in my mind and sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes, I saw it. Light, street lights filtering in through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see a meager street lamp. But as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart sank. At the end of the path was a black silhouette. Unmoving, contrasted against the light background, was the dark figure of a man. What should I do? Maybe it's a different person. Perhaps it's someone walking their dog. I froze and watched them silently, but they didn't move. At all. They just stood there like they were guarding the entrance to the woods. I didn't know what to do. By this point, I'd had enough. I was so close to getting out, I decided to just run straight towards the exit. Straight towards them. I was a 6-foot young man. If they wanted to stop me, they'd have a hard job of it, I thought. So that's what I did. I started sprinting. The figure grew and grew, and as I reached them, I stepped to the side. I heard someone growl, "Fuck," loudly, and felt something clip the back of my head and tug the back of my jacket. I cleared the sheep gate in one leap and sprinted into the light. I eventually stopped running when I could see the first house and looked back. The entrance to the woods was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing by the entrance. Relaxing a bit more now, I finished my walk home. That's pretty much it. I know I could have overreacted. It could have been someone out for a walk in the woods, a dog walker, camper. But what I thought was strange was that they didn't use their torch. It didn't use their torch, except briefly on one occasion. Once they heard me, they also actively sought me out. Who knows what would have happened if they caught me? In any case, I never walked that way home alone again. Not at night, anyway. Hardly anyone knows it, but Windfall, Indiana exists. It exists in such a way that when you're there, you feel like you're in a completely separate world. No shops, no restaurants, no anything. Just a gas station, a bar, a post office, and some dirt roads. It has an energy to it, like you can feel a thickness in the air that offsets your intuition. It makes a human being's natural senses spike, like an animal who knows a predator is nearby. At least, that's how I personally feel about it. The entire place is off-putting. The people aren't much better either. I was only 13 when we moved there. My older sister was 16 and my younger one was 12. Both of them did considerably better than I did socially at school, and I was often left by myself at our new home. Mom was working quite a bit and often stayed after hours. She said it was because we needed the money, and I'm positive we did, but I think it was more to keep her mind off the divorce. The new house was small, a 3-bed, 1-bath with a dining room and a living room. We had a fenced-in backyard and a muddy lawn with an old tree sagging over it. It was the dead of winter, and as a 13-year-old girl going through her first of many depressive episodes to come, I submerged myself into the internet. I came home every day to an empty house, made myself a snack, and planted myself on the couch to get lost in a YouTube rabbit hole until my eyes hurt. We'd only lived in the house for a couple of weeks, but I was beginning to adjust to a new life. Sure, I didn't like Windfall, but I wasn't afraid of our house. School was miserable, but I cherished my time to myself. I felt as if I was getting a small taste of the adult life 13-year-old me was so eager to have. I wasn't scared to be alone until I caught sight of him. Sometimes in my YouTube crusade, I'd get distracted by the TV and my laptop screen would fall asleep. I'd look down and jiggle my mouse to get back to it, but this time, there was a small shape standing behind me in the doorway of my mom's bedroom. Just a short apparition with noticeably spiked hair. He didn't move, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up straight and my skin began to break out in goosebumps. As quick as he appeared, he was gone. I hadn't turned to face him, but I knew in my heart it had to be a little boy. I wasn't afraid of him. The house was old, and I felt that maybe he was just curious. I didn't get the feeling that he was bad or that I should fear him. He just surprised me, was all. It became normal to see him. Most times he was in the reflection of my screen. Other times I'd look up and see him leaning against the doorway of the dining room. He was never in color, only a black shadow that faded away as soon as I blinked. I didn't want to tell my sisters or my mom. I'd been getting horribly bullied at school nearly every day, and I felt if I were to say something, they'd make fun of me or simply call me crazy. I didn't want them to think I couldn't handle being alone. Either way, he was harmless. At first, he seemed harmless. Soon, he began to appear closer to me, or things in the house would fall over mysteriously. Cabinets would slam shut, or the TV would turn off. Curtains would sway as if someone had run their hand through them. I'd just blare my headphones and stay put on the couch, staring at my laptop and praying that somebody, anybody, would come home. I'd see him, and my face and palms would begin to sweat. I started to feel like maybe the curious spirit wasn't so innocent, like he was teasing me or pushing his limits to see just what he could do to instill fear in me. I'd never tried to talk to him or communicate, and quite honestly, I had no interest in trying. The first time I ever saw him in detail, I was in my bed. My little sister and I shared a room, and I had the top bunk while she was on the bottom. I began to wake in the middle of the night, sweaty with my heart racing. Each night I'd look over the railing of my bed and see him standing in the dead center of my room, staring at my little sister as she slept. He could have only been 7 years old. He was skinny, and he had a red plaid button-up shirt tucked into black pants. He had spiked, bleach blonde hair and pale blue eyes. What stuck out about him was how white his skin was. He looked nearly albino, yet his lips were a shade of deep purple. I'd be too afraid to close my eyes or even breathe. I'd wake in the nights to come, holding my eyes shut because I knew when I opened them, he'd be there. Some nights, my sister wouldn't be in her bed because she was still young enough to want to be in Mom's bed. He'd still just stand there, staring, not acknowledging me or letting it be known that he knew I was there. But I knew he knew. As I kept this secret, our household began to fall apart. My sisters and I were constantly fighting. My depression was worsening, and self-harm crept into my daily life. My mother began to drink heavily, and in fits of rage or sadness, she'd say things she didn't mean. She'd changed into a person filled with anger when she'd once been so loving and sweet. My family began to feel like strangers to me. This led to even more time in the house on my own, as my sisters used their friends' houses as an escape. I had made no friends at my new school, so the only thing I could do to get away was to take walks to the gas station or to play with the dog the next door neighbors kept chained outside to a tree. Every time I'd see the little boy, I'd stop what I was doing and go sit with that dog. I'd stay put for a few hours until someone arrived home. Things hit their peak when it came time for me to bathe. I loved baths, but for some reason, when I took baths at this house, I felt nothing but anxiety. My chest would tighten and burn when I'd lay back to wash my hair, and I'd feel like I couldn't bring myself back up. I'd scream for my mother because I often felt paralyzed with fear. Even just looking at the bathtub gave me an uneasy feeling and sent my heartbeat banging through my ears. Eventually, my anxiety about baths evolved into a full-fledged fear of water. Swimming pools, baths, lakes, it's all ruined for me. When I think back on it, it never felt as if the house had happiness to it, only darkness and that same energy that Windfall emitted so strongly. I was overcome with relief when Mom let us know that she and my stepdad had worked things out, and we'd be moving back home. I couldn't have gotten out of that house fast enough. The only thing I didn't want to leave behind was the neighbor's dog. I had learned to shove away those memories. The little boy's face still popped up in my dreams from time to time, but I'd gotten over my anxiety of being home alone. Mom got better, and she eventually went back to being her old self again. Time passed, and the depression got easier to manage. I'd nearly forgotten about him. We'd all been drinking around the bonfire one night, shooting the breeze and talking about old memories. I was 20 now and felt that I could bring up the boy and handle whatever backlash I got from it. I asked my mom if she remembered the house and if she ever saw anything there. "Oh, for sure. That place was haunted as anything," were her exact words. "Yeah," my older sister chimed in. "There was a little boy there, but he was not a little boy." I felt my heart drop to my stomach. He was evil. I'd always see him running around the dining room table or standing in Mom's doorway. "That's why I was always at Olivia's, because I hated that house," she continued. I told them my story, all of it. I told them why I'd suddenly become so afraid of water and why I hated being alone. It wasn't just him. There was an old woman there too, my mom said. She'd stand in the dining room and tell me to get out of her house. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and she'd be standing at the end of my bed staring at me, angry as anything. That's why I'd get up in the middle of the night and grab your sister out of bed so she could sleep next to me because I was so scared. The worst time it happened, I woke up and saw that boy sitting on my dresser, swinging his legs. He hopped off the dresser, walked to the side of my bed, and jumped at me. He jumped straight at me and then disappeared, Mom continued. When we left, I looked up the house, and it turns out an old lady used to own that house, and she died there. "What about the little boy?" I asked. "Yeah, a little boy died in the house back in the 70s. He drowned to death." Since leaving the house, I've returned to Windfall a handful of times to visit family. The energy is still there, that heaviness and otherworldliness. As years go on, more and more ghost stories emerge from Windfall and the people who've lived there. Native American spirits and little children, there's something about that place that falls just perfectly on a wave of paranormal possibility. It radiates with things I don't know if we as a species will ever be able to wrap our heads around. Windfall, Indiana exists, and so does everything else in it. My friend and I are still trying to process exactly what we saw the other day. We've talked it through countless times, trying to logically figure out how this was possible. Hopefully someone on here can give us some thoughts and ideas as to what actually happened. So I recently purchased a small bass boat, and my first mate, Legov, and I have been super eager to explore the lake and its islands, as well as learn the fishing around it. We're new to Tennessee. Yesterday, on the 4th of July, we decided to go fishing in this very secluded part of the lake we named No Man's Land, because of the low-hanging bridge that prevents boaters from entering the section. My boat can make it underneath because of how small it is, but I've never seen another boat in there. We decided to go deeper into the cove than we've ever been before. As we're slowly trolling down the lake, the path before us splits into 3 forks, and I ask which fork we should take. Legov immediately says the middle one, so we continue straight as the water changes from a large lake to a narrow river-like path. This is where a chain of events happened in quick succession, and we've talked through it after the fact to try and recall the order of how this went down. First, we heard a weird vocal-like noise coming from the woods beyond the shoreline, and we both tensed up and felt very uneasy. "What was that?" Legov asked. "A dog," I said, as that was the first thing that came to mind. "I don't think that was a dog," Legov answered immediately. Then we saw a bird high above us, perching on a branch, staring at us. "Maybe it was that bird," Legov said. "Yeah, maybe," I answered. I'm not sure when it got into my hand, but at some point, I drew my pistol and held it down at my side. Legov held the fishing bow. We both had a very weird feeling as we drifted down the river, eyes glued to the bank. We came to a rotting pine tree that had fallen and was now half submerged in the water, sitting on the shoreline. Then it happened. We hear a very loud, heavy-footed animal running through the woods, getting closer to the water. At first, I thought it was a deer, as it was almost prancing, but as it got closer and louder, we both realized it was, in fact, not a deer. It was a very large, jet-black canine. My brain thought, oh, it must be a coyote. But this was much bigger, like a huge German shepherd. And it was fast, like a black shadow, leaping through the trees and quickly approaching the bank that we were floating across from. It didn't seem to have any texture and details, though, almost like it was flat and blurry. We couldn't see fur or its face and eyes, just the outline of its body and tall wolf-like ears. But it was obviously the body of a canine. Adrenaline started rushing through us, and my brain raced, thinking we were about to have to defend ourselves. It almost looked as if it were charging at us, but it was zigzagging and dodging through the trees toward the exact portion of the shoreline we were floating past. We were scared, but the 15 feet of water between our boat and the shoreline gave us some confidence. It would have to swim out to us, and I didn't see that as likely. It continued its leaping through the woods and quickly reached our portion of the shoreline. In one majestic, fluid motion, it leaped off the shore and dove into the water right under the half-submerged pine tree in front of us. Stomp, 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 splash. That was it. We held our breath as we waited to hear it swim or move toward us. Small ripples reached our boat from the splash. After the fact, Legov swears the splash should have been much bigger for a creature that size. Watch for it to come back up, I whispered. I had never heard of canines being able to submerge themselves underwater, but here it was happening right in front of our eyes. We waited. Nothing. Silence. Just the subtle sound of the ripples it made slowly dissipating. We waited about 20 more seconds and still nothing. It was almost as if the entire forest had shut off. Silence. Our eyes were glued to the fallen pine tree it dove under. Maybe it's just standing in the water under the tree, Legov says. We get the courage to troll the boat a little closer to inspect the tree, but there's nothing. No sign of anything. At this point, we're in complete shock. Stunned. It's gone. How could it be gone? How does something that big just vanish, especially a huge creature like that? After 30 more seconds of silence, Legov breaks it with, "You saw what I saw, right?" A shiver flashes down my spine. "All of it," I reply. "Really, though? What the heck was that?" Legov said. I replied, "I think we saw a demon," and we both nervously laughed. We stayed floating near the shoreline in shock for at least another 10 minutes, hoping for a sign that we weren't crazy. Legov scoured the waters looking to see if it would come up for air. It never did. How in the world could a big black wolf-like creature disappear into thin air, or water for that matter? Being skeptics, there has to be a logical explanation to what we saw, but we can't find one. If it had just splashed the water and gotten out again, 1, we would have seen it walk away in whatever direction, and 2, we would have heard it as anything putting weight on the leaves makes a loud noise. But it was just silence. The loudest of silences. We live in Middle Tennessee, if that helps at all. We're still a little shaken up by this. This is 100% true. We are not kidding you. Any insight would be much appreciated. When I was a child, I had a friend named Lucy. She was a neighborhood girl who would come over to my grandmother's house, which was where I lived at the time. There was a park by my house that had a deep creek next to it. I couldn't swim, so we always had to have an adult with us when near the creek. Lucy was always a toxic friend, but I didn't know. She would always threaten to stop being friends with me or stop talking to me if I didn't do what she wanted. She would also always say that she deserved my toys and my family and friends more than I did. I didn't mind this, as I had a hard time making friends, and Lucy was one of my only friends. One night, Lucy came over and said she was bored and wanted to go to the park. I told her my family was in the backyard and we had to have an adult with us to go, but she said she would leave and never come back if I didn't go to the park with her. I followed her, and we went to the park. She walked right past the playground equipment to the creek, and I asked her what she was doing. She said she wanted to swim, and I told her I couldn't swim. She called me a string of hurtful names, including weak, stupid, and an awful friend. This really hurt my 5-year-old self, so I started crying. This made her even angrier, and she told me something I'll never forget. You're an awful child. Your family deserved me and not you. I was so confused and sad that I just ran home. I never saw her again, and I just thought she was so angry she really never spoke to me again. Now, about a year ago, my family was talking about my many imaginary friends, and my mom said, my friend Lucy really creeped her out because she was supposed to have a daughter before me who they wanted to name Lucy. My mother had a miscarriage, and Lucy was never born. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you have a story to share, send it to creepychefmedia@gmail.com. Stay spooky.